Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, I'm going to tell you the story of Charles Ives. This telling is going to be Fourth Symphony centric because the series has been about the Fourth Symphony. So I will be emphasizing details that involve its development within his life. But at the same time, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know to really understand Ives and where he came from and why he wrote the music that he did. And hopefully it will disambiguate it and allow for you to, engage with his music in a really, really positive manner. So, who was Charles Ives? Well, he was an American composer born in Danbury, Connecticut in 1874, and he died in New York City in 1954. He wrote almost all of his music between 1900 and 1930, but his music doesn't really fit into any conventional box, and he wasn't writing music on commission for anyone. He just wrote it, for his own need. And to understand it, you really kind of have to understand where he came from. Well, he was born to George and Molly Ives. George Ives was a bandmaster. At age 17, he had led a Union band that played in front of Lincoln during the Civil War. And he continued as a bandmaster in Danbury, which was no small position, in fact, because town bands at that time provided musical entertainment for communities on the weekends. So if you couldn't afford to go into the metropolis to hear the Philharmonic play symphonic music, you could hear transcriptions of that music played by the town band. But it was more than that. They would play popular tunes. They would have soloists who would sing with the band. The audience itself would sing along with the band. And it was just a community event. The whole Sing Along with the Bouncing Ball cartoons you may have seen from 100 years ago may actually have come out of that tradition. So what he was doing for the community was no small feat. But he was not an average musician at all. He was kind of a Frank Zappa character. He was interested not just in music, but in sound itself and what sound could do and what music could do when sounds were manipulated. For example, he was interested in bitonality years before Stravinsky was. And as a parlor experiment, he would have his family sing Swanee River in E flat while he would accompany them in the key of C to hear two keys at once. He noticed that the intervals coming from the carillon were not exactly right. And that, there were these cracks in the notes of the keys of the piano, and you could get notes, more than 12 notes per octave. So he created some zither-like instrument, presumably, to get all the quarter tones. And then, most notably and most famously, he divided the town band into two halves and had each half play a different piece of music and march in the opposite direction around the town square. And he and young Charles, his son, whose musical talent he recognized early on, stood at the point where the two bands would pass each other, and they listened to this, this growing cacophony as the two bands approached from opposite sides of the square and then passed each other and then, disappeared again. So Charles, as I said, he had musical talent that he recognized early on. So he gave him music instruction, and he taught him harmony and counterpoint and all the things that you need to know. But he always emphasized to him, you must know these rules, but you shouldn't feel constrained by them. You should always feel free to think outside the box. Just because all the horses have their tails bobbed in the prevailing fashion doesn't mean that ours has to follow suit. So Ives had this interesting encouragement from his father during those years. And during those years, he was playing drums in his father's band. And when he didn't have a drum to practice on, his father would say, well, just bang out the rhythms on the piano keyboard. It's just as good as anything else. Now, what piano teacher would ever tell a student to do that, right? Now, Charles's piano skills were not just limited to banging, as you might imagine if you know his mature music, but he was quite fluent at the keyboard. And he eventually transitioned into playing organ and became so masterful at it that at the age of 13, he became the youngest professional organist in the state of Connecticut, working as a supply organist, meaning someone who would travel around and fill in for music directors who couldn't perform services on a given weekend. So he would go in and rehearse the choir and prepare the hymns and then, lead the music during the service. Now, at the same time, he was developing into quite the athlete. He was the captain of the baseball team and the football team during his teenage years, when he was in grammar school, as they called it at the time. And then again at Yale, he was also the captain of the baseball and the football teams. So he was quite accomplished, both in music and in athletics. But this proved a problem. Following the Civil War, the arts were pushed to the back burner. The country was far more concerned with rebuilding itself and repairing its infrastructure and that kind of thing. And that's all understandable, but the arts have suffered ever since. And perhaps during that period, something took place which isn't fully, clear to me, in its origins, but an association between involvement in the arts and effeminacy became ingrained in the American mind. And young men in the United States who get involved in any of the arts end up with these accusations of effeminacy because of this. And Charles Ives was not immune to it. It was right there for him during his teenage years. He'd be walking along the street with his baseball teammates, and a woman would stop them and see Ives and say, "Oh, you're the cute little boy who plays organ," pinching his cheek. And he'd say, "I don't play organ, I play shortstop." Defending his masculinity by using his athleticism as a shield. Well, when you're playing sports, you can do that. But then later on, when sports are gone and you're making music, then how do you defend yourself? Well, Ives did it with dissonance. In his mind, consonant music was effeminate and dissonant music was masculine. So if you couldn't handle someone going to a piano keyboard and banging all the keys down with your forearms, well, then you were a sissy. And he wrote about the emasculation of music, and he called Rachmaninoff rock not man enough. His father helped him out here because the father had taught him that banging on the piano was perfectly fine and there was nothing wrong with it. So if it's good enough for father, it's good enough for me, and hey, this is a good defense against accusations of effeminacy. So even there, his father's influence is felt. Now, adding to the mix was a growing love of literature. Ives came from a family of readers, and they loved especially the transcendentalists, American authors of the 19th century, such as Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Bronson Alcott and Walt Whitman. These were authors who believed in this, quintessentially American philosophy that you could transcend from the local to the universal, and there was this oversoul that connected all. And the Ives family was especially proud of the fact that Emerson himself had stayed with them. This was part of family lore. And Ives grew up with this and was very impressed by it and took it all to heart and read these authors with great interest. And Emerson in particular was very impactful to him. And so this is something else that works into the soup in Ives's mind and informs his psychology and went on to inform and shape the music that he wrote. Well, who do you have at this point? Well, you have someone raised in a very musical environment with this bandmaster father who was having him play drums in the town band, and then on the weekends he's rehearsing choirs and learning hymnody at churches, and then he's going to barn dances and hearing fiddle tunes and that kind of thing. And he's also this accomplished athlete, and then he's also having to sort of guard against his masculinity because of the mores that were developing at the time. And the center of all this is this incredible father who was exposing him to these bizarre, madcap musical experiences that any child would have found fascinating. And to someone with musician's ears, it was especially interesting to him. And that his father was also teaching him music, but also making him think outside or encouraging him to think outside the box and to not feel constrained. And then there's this influence of transcendentalism and connecting the local to the universal, and all of this is swimming together in this fantastic childhood. And then he goes off to Yale in the fall of 1894, and during his first semester, his father dies of a stroke. And this crushes him because everything in his life up to that point had had his father at the center. Who filled the void? Well, his music instructor at Yale, Horatio Parker. Now, who was he? Well, Parker had been groomed in Europe, and everyone thought that he was going to go on to be the great American composer who would lift America's music, out of this, chasm of the 19th century into something of great prominence. But it didn't work out that way. Parker is known as a footnote in music history as Ives' instructor at Yale. And it wasn't a good relationship, according to Ives. It was oil and water. Ives would modulate all the time, and Parker was, he was confused by this. And Ives would always appeal to his father and say, well, father would say this and father would say that. Now, moving ahead in years, when Ives wrote his memos, he talks about his father constantly. It's like ancestor worship, said John Kirkpatrick. There's a constant appeal to the father and to the directive of the father, and this psychological bond that Ives had with his dad is quite extraordinary and should not be de-emphasized. But going back to his Yale years, where did he find the greater influence? In his literature courses, studying under William Phelps, whom he admired and wrote about lovingly. And he graduated from Yale, though, still, determined to make a go at music. He had graduated with a gentleman's D+ with a major in English literature, but nonetheless, music had been in the curriculum for him the entire time, and he did want to become a composer. So he wrote a piece of music in the style of Parker. He wrote this piece called The Celestial Country, not The Celestial Railroad, that was sort of a carbon copy of a piece by Parker that was called Hora Novissima. And Ives' piece got a very polite reception in the press following its premiere. And that was it. Ives thought, if this is what it means to be a composer in the United States, I want nothing to do with it. The Celestial Country was premiered in 1902. Ives had just graduated from Yale in 1898. And so what's smack dab in the middle of those two dates? Well, 1900. It's the end of the 19th century. And in with the 20th century comes radio and telephone and moving picture and all these forms of entertainment that displaced everything that had come before. So the town bands that he grew up with all vanished. No one needed them anymore. The kinds of culture that he had experienced in small-town New England was no longer present. It had all been wiped away by the new technologies of the 20th century. And so he entered Yale losing his father, and he exited Yale losing the culture that he'd grown up in. Well, what next? He turned to one of his friends from Yale, Julian Myrick, and they went into insurance together, and they formed an insurance agency, Ives and Myrick. It became the most successful insurance company on the East Coast. And in fact, Ives invented estate planning. That is his brainchild. If you go into insurance and you study estate planning, today you might actually read individual sentences that have remained intact through the years that Ives wrote way back when. All right, so that's what happened with him professionally. What about personally? Well, he fell in love with Harmony Twitchell, the most desirable girl in Danbury. She had been a nurse and probably had the right temperament to partner with someone who had such a delicate disposition as Ives did. And they married in 1907, and they tried to have a child, but there was a miscarriage followed by a hysterectomy. So they had no natural children. However, by way of the Fresh Air Fund, which existed at that time, a young girl came to stay with them, and they liked her so much that they fell in love with her and decided to adopt her, and she became their daughter, Edith. Now, Edith died before Charles Ives did, so we have no accounts from her as to what it was like growing up with Charles Ives as her father, but we can hope that it was a lovely relationship and that she had a blessed childhood and so on. But back to Ives himself, what happened to music? Well, he didn't drop it. It just became a side activity for him. But it wasn't just something he was just dilly-dallying about in. It was something he was working on assiduously and with great fervor, because he produced thousands of music manuscripts, almost 10,000 pages of music manuscripts altogether that are just black with notation. And what kind of music was he writing? Well, if you've been following this series, then it's quotations of hymn tunes and band tunes and fiddle tunes all swirling together in this kaleidoscopic whirlwind of of a transcendental ecstasy, with this late Romanticism rebottled with modernisms that were inspired by the experiments of his father and the things that he witnessed his father do when he was young. There are two songs that Ives wrote out of the many that he created that have lyrics that really sum up who he was and where he came from and what is going on in his head. And here they are. The first is called Remembrance, and the lyric is very simple. It's just a single sentence. It reads, "A sound of a distant horn or shadowed lake is born, my father's song." So there you have it in that one song, in that one lyric, this profound love and reverence for his father, someone who had opened his mind and his ears to all that could be done with sound, and who had shown him, hiding in plain sight in the landscape were these wonderful things, and all you had to do was just turn over a few rocks and you'd expose them to the daylight, and then everyone could see them. So there in that lyric, you have the love for the father and this sense that he had been given a prime directive. He had been handed a torch by the father to go forward and to explore music and sound. That's the first one. The next one is a song called "The Things Our Fathers Loved." And the lyrics go, "I think there must be a place in the soul all made of tunes of long ago. I hear the organ on the Main Street corner, Aunt Sarah humming gospels, summer evenings, the village cornet band playing in the square, the town's red, white, and blue, all red, white, and blue. Now, hear the songs. I know not what are the words, but they sing in my soul of the things our fathers loved." Here we have the other side of the coin, this incredible nostalgia for the music of the community that he grew up in, the small town in late 19th century New England. In these communities, the hymn tunes, band tunes, and fiddle tunes were common parlance. They ran in the blood of everyone, and they unified the culture. They unified the community. And Ives wanted to preserve this music and also extol it. He wrote, if Mozart and Haydn could use beer hall tunes as themes in symphonies, why couldn't he take the Song of the Washerwoman or the Song of the Tinsmith and use them as themes in his own music, in an attempt to transcend from the local to the universal in transcendental fashion? Well, so he did. And so in this song, you see this is the other component of his music, this incredible reverence for this music from this period and an attempt to use it to transcend the local to the universal. Ives lived a double life as an insurance executive during the day, father, and then composer at night and on weekends. And he did this for years, and it eventually caught up with him. And he had a series of what they called, heart attacks, but it's more likely, a nervous breakdown that he had around 1918. And then at the same time, there was a pandemic. And so mortality was on everyone's mind, and I'm sure it was not far from Ives's mind, having gone through this breakdown. So he realized he needed to do something about this huge body of work that he had created. So he said, what, I should take this piano sonata that I've been working on and this book of songs whose lyrics are so meaningful to me and just distribute them freely. So he went to Schirmer in New York, and he said, I have these two pieces, and I'd like to have them engraved. And Schirmer said, nobody would want to buy this. This is bizarre music. It doesn't make any sense. He said, no, you don't understand. I'm not asking you to publish this. I want to have copies printed. I want this to be professionally engraved and copies to be printed, and then I will distribute them myself. He said, well, this is going to cost you a mint. And he said, money's no object. Just send me the bill. So he said, fine. And in the early 1920s, he had his second piano sonata, Concord, Massachusetts, 1840 to 1860. That's the subtitle. And then his book of 114 songs, not all the songs he wrote, but a collection of 114 of them, privately printed. This is an original copy of Ives's 114 songs, which Schirmer engraved and printed for him, and that he collected and then distributed himself. And the way he did it was to put an ad in the paper. And he told the Evening Sun that he wanted an ad stating that songs containing, his greatest philosophies and ideals were, available, and this copywriter penned this thing that just said, get a nifty songbook free right to this guy. And so Ives was inundated with requests for what everyone apparently assumed was just a book of parlor songs. And of course it is not anything like that. And very quickly he exhausted the initial print run of 500 copies. And he had to order a second print run, which looks like this. So the first print run was green and the second one was blue. There's another difference, that there's a song Grantchester that is absent in the first print run, but it's present in the second one. So he also distributed likewise his Concord Sonata. And that's how people first began to learn of his music. This process of distributing his music freely began in January of 1921. And the songbook and the sonata spread across the country, in fact, all the way to California, where Wunderkind composer Henry Cowell was in the process of starting up a new publication of ultramodern scores. He thought that there should be something like the Etude, which was a publication that had lovely little parlor piano pieces and things like that, should exist for ultramodern compositions. And the very first issue of New Music contained Men in Mountains by Carl Ruggles, which is a very dissonant and bold work. And half the subscribers canceled their subscriptions. Ives sent in a check for additional subscriptions. Now, Cowell had seen Ives's music and knew of him, and he'd obviously seen that he was on the roster of people to receive the very first issue. But with that check and that letter that Ives sent began this correspondence and friendship. And Cowell said, well, Mr. Ives, we've been very interested in your music. Is there anything that you might want to see in print? And Ives said, well, in fact, there is something. I just had 2 movements of a symphony that I wrote played just back in January of 27. And so let's take a detour and talk about that just for a second. In 1927, the Fourth Symphony actually had a partial premiere. The first 2 movements were performed on a concert in Town Hall, New York City, under the baton of Eugene Goossens, with an orchestra consisting of members from the New York Philharmonic. But there were only 50 of them that were available, so this was a scaled-down orchestra. And during the rehearsals, Ives was in the hall, but he hung out in the green room and wouldn't come out. And Goossens had to keep going back to that green room with the score saying, how do I conduct this thing? You've got 17 meters going on simultaneously, and I don't know what beat pattern to use. And Ives would say, well, just do X, Y, and Z. And Goossens would go, okay, I'll try that. And the musicians were understandably confused, saying, who is this weird composer who, won't come out of the green room? So he's a little shy. Don't worry. He's actually underwriting this concert. So just bear with it. Now, a bit about the underwriting. When musicians and composers would approach Ives with ideas about how his music could be added to a concert, and they would then be asking for money for help getting the concert off the ground, he would always say, all right, here's how it's going to work. My piece cannot come first, and it cannot come last, and you must emphasize the other composers on the program. He was always more concerned about others than he was himself. The young composers especially, he felt needed full support. And in his will, he set up an instrument so that there could be an annual award given. It continues to this day, the Charles Ives Living Award, in which a composer is funded for 2 consecutive years. And during that period, they're able to live quite comfortably off the money that is supplied them. And their only requirement is that they write music. And they may earn income from other sources, but it must always only be from composing music. It cannot come from some other activity. But now back to Cowell. So the Fourth Symphony had this partial premiere in 1927, so it was very much on Ives's mind. So when Cowell suggested that a work of Ives appear in this new music publication, Ives said, well, there is this Fourth Symphony I wrote, and maybe the second movement would be an interesting thing to appear. And Cowell said, well, that sounds great, let's take care of the engraving here on the West Coast. So I've sent the manuscript out to San Francisco, and one by one, every music engraving firm there turned it down. So Cal sent it to Chicago, and there, everyone turned it down. And then it went to Philadelphia, and the same thing happened. And then it ended up back in New York. Every single time, engraving firms would look at the music, and they'd all just gasp at the complexity of it. And no one wanted to touch the thing until it got to the office of Joseph Rank. Rank oversaw a staff of experienced engravers, and not one of them wanted to touch the thing. But recently employed was a young man named Hermann Langinger, who had previously been a violinist. And he had just begun learning the craft of engraving, and he saw this as this fantastic problem to be unraveled and to be solved. And he said, "Oh, boss, let me do it. I'll do it." And Rank said, "Well, okay, if this guy's willing to pay the bill, go for it. Torture yourself with this project, fine." And so Ives was able to come in and consult Langinger and help him and correct the proofs in person. It worked out just perfectly that it was being done right there in New York City. In an interview decades later, Langinger told Vivian Perlis that the first page was a math problem. That figuring out how to engrave that first page of the movement was just the most difficult thing of all. But once it had been solved, everything else just followed naturally. And the engraving process stretched to the end of 1928, and then it was put into print as New Music, January 1929, the Fourth Symphony of Charles Ives. Well, it's not the Fourth Symphony, it's the second movement of the Fourth Symphony, but whatever, this was its first publication. It was around that time that Ives began to complain that he had run out of ideas and that there was nothing left for him to compose, and his compositional activity stopped. But that's exactly when interest in his music was really picking up, and performances began to appear here and there. And again, he would help out financially behind the scenes, but he never wanted anyone to know, and he always wanted other composers to be emphasized on those programs in which his music was appearing. What happened to the Fourth Symphony? Well, Bernard Herrmann, who is famous for scoring so many Alfred Hitchcock films, took an interest in Ives in the 30s and made an original arrangement of both the prelude and the fugue, and he premiered his arrangement of the fugue in 1933. And then later, in 1936, that arrangement was broadcast over CBS radio, and Ives heard the broadcast. There was a recording made of it, and Ives listened to it subsequently on a record player with a wooden needle, of all things. In the 40s, the New York Philharmonic's conductor, Artur Rajensky, was very intrigued by the Fourth Symphony, most likely because of what he saw in the New Music edition of the second movement. But the problem was that there wasn't a complete set of parts. There were parts that had been created for that partial premiere in 1927, but they weren't the best, and they were for a scaled-down orchestra, and so it just couldn't happen. Lou Harrison, another West Coast composer like Cal, took an interest in Ives's music and got to know Ives personally, and while visiting him once, he saw the score to the Third Symphony. He thought it was fascinating. He thought, I could probably do a performance of this. And so Ives agreed. And in 1946, he premiered the thing. And then in 1947, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And Ives was actually furious. He said, "What mess have you gotten me into? I didn't want this exposure." And he threw the check back at Harrison. And that was just, the way he was. He was extremely shy, almost pathologically shy. He didn't really attend performances of his own music, except for certain notable circumstances. And this was because his music was so psychological and so intensely personal. And it dealt with these very central issues of his childhood and the musical culture he grew up in, and most importantly, the relationship he had with his father. So for him to attend a performance of his music was to watch someone go out and just, expose Ives for who he was and his psychology to the entire crowd. And that was just something that he had difficulty with, of course. And so it would make sense when you think about that he did not attend the premiere of his Second Symphony when Bernstein conducted it in February of 1951. Harmony attended it. She was there in the box, one of the boxes, watching it. At the end, she said to the people who accompanied her, well, they seem to like it, don't they, during this tumultuous applause that followed it. Well, where was Ives? Well, he was at home listening to it on the radio. He just couldn't bear to be present for the thing. It wasn't that he didn't have gratitude for it taking place. It was just this shyness and this, psychological constitution that he had. 3 years later, Ives died at age 79. It happened on May 19th, 1954 in New York City. And in the years that followed, Harmony lived on for another 14 years. And she died in 1968. And she helped John Kirkpatrick deliver all of his manuscripts, well, almost all of them, 99 and 44, 100% of them, to the Yale Music Library. And there, John Kirkpatrick organized them all. He had a legendary ability at jigsaw puzzles, and he was correspondingly quite adept at looking at, unsorted manuscripts of Ives and figuring out which pages went with which pieces. And his labors resulted in this tome called A Temporary Mimeographed Catalog of the Music and Manuscripts and Related Works of Charles Ives. And that was the standard reference for any Ives researcher who went to the Yale Library to look at those manuscripts in the years that followed. It should be noted that Kirkpatrick always intended his catalog to be temporary, and it should be superseded by something eventually. And in fact, in the late 90s, Jim Sinclair labored for several years to put together its successor, which is this work, A Descriptive Catalog of the Music of Charles Ives. It's a huge tome, and it is the definitive reference text to all of Ives's manuscripts, those at the Yale Library and those found elsewhere. And thankfully, it is available online. Now, one of the complications that Ives had left for everyone following him was that he hadn't been careful about how he was assigning music to publishers. He just did it in this kind of, pell-mell way. So instead of just working with one publisher during his lifetime, as publishers became interested in working with him, he just would give pieces to whichever publisher happened to appear at his doorstep who wanted to, put one of his works in print. So there's something like 7 different publishers have the copyrights to his music, with 3 of them having the bulk of the copyrights, and they are Schirmer AMP, Marian Music, which is Theodore Presser, and Peer. And there's crossover of material. So the Country Band March, which appears in the Fourth Symphony and in 3 places in New England, is jointly owned by Marian Music and Schirmer AMP. And so the publishers have had to agree to disagree about this problem of the same materials appearing in different works that are in each of their catalogs, and say, okay, we're just going to accept this as just a necessary complication of this composer. But the task remained that all the stuff that had not been put in print during Ives' lifetime needed to be in print, and that stuff that had been put into print needed to be reviewed. And so the Charles Ives Society was formed in the late 60s with an interest in getting the remaining works in print and cleaning up the other ones. And so this is probably where we should segue into a dedicated video on the history of the Fourth Symphony.